Well, here we are, the last week of the class, not counting finals week, and frankly, I'm pretty astonished that we're here already. This has been such a good journey for me, I hope for you, to this point. This week is focused on attempting to tie the semester together, and the principal means to accomplish that task is with the final chapter of Practicing Theology, a chapter that may be perhaps the most important part of the book because it organically flows out of all the work you've read and done before it. In this final essay, Miroslav Volf provides a fitting close to the book and to our time together. As Bass points out, her and Dijkstra's initial entry, A Theological Understanding of Christian Practices, and Volf's final essay, A Theology for a Way of Life, address the overarching themes of the course. I almost said the overarching theme of the course, not plural, because I think this book, finally, this chapter, this whole process and course, really, is an introduction to the fundamental element of all Christian practices. In fact, I think to all of Christian life, and that is the practice of discernment. As I've said before, discernment is the practice of determining an individual's or a community's direction in regard to a challenge, a need, a problem, a mission. In the Christian practice of discernment, it is an individual's or a community's effort to determine with the aid and inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And that is where this is distinguished from what we might call secular discernment practices. The role of the Holy Spirit in Christian practice is the heart of the practice. It helps us determine what is good and what the Lord requires. It asks, as we read in Micah, how do I or how do we act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly? We recognize those words as a desired outcome, but what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? Those are the discernment questions. You see, I think discernment is the central practice of the church. It is the central practice of the people of God. If you read the Bible with eyes and ears wide open, I think you discover that the people of God have always been trying to figure out what this surprising and unexpected God surprisingly and unexpectedly wants. Sometimes there's no question. Sometimes there's just simple obedience, an obedience that we don't really understand. It just happens. God shows up to Abram and says, I want you to move to a place, and I'll tell you when you get to that place that this is the place. And for Abram, for reasons of his own, we don't know, gets up and goes. Moses, on the other hand, is encountered by a burning bush that does not burn and is told to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. To this pretty obvious supernatural call, Moses presents a series of questions that we often characterize as cowardly excuses. But honestly, I think they're questions that most of us would ask, right? We could go on with this for several hundred years, but those questions that Moses asks lead him to commitment and to obedience. Now, we could go on with this for several hundred years, but I will just close this rumination by noting that on the night Jesus was taken captive and dragged off eventually to the cross, he was asking the Father, is there no other way? A practice of discernment. Discernment and obedience, key words that are connected. It is the way we and the church lives, or should live, perhaps, because God is always asking us to leave the comforts of home and go somewhere, and he will let us know we have arrived there when we have arrived there. In her introduction, Bass writes about this final essay, that Wolf argues this: practices are not external to Christian beliefs and doctrine, but integral to them. He concludes that theology, whose object of study is God and God's relationship to the world, ought to be pursued chiefly in the service of a Christian way of life. Finally, I guess the point is that there can be no true separation if we're going to live congruently, if we're going to live honestly, if we're going to live up to our beliefs. There can be no true separation between what we believe and how we live, whether we're talking about that as an individual or as a community of people called together in God's name to worship God. The questions that we have been living with this whole semester are those that form around the deep conviction that nothing matters more than our beliefs and how we live them out. The question of integrity and congruity are at the heart of any exploration of a Christian way of life. I think this final essay is worth the price of the whole book, and I hope that you will spend some quality time with this essay before you begin to move on to your final reflection. And I, as always, look forward to engaging with you about your typically thoughtful reflections on this important call to faith and courage. Blessings on the journey.